Hello, how you guys doing? Hey, I want to go ahead and get through this real as quickly as possible. We are studying the people of ancient Israel, and a lot of the stuff you hear, for a lot of you, it's going to be very familiar. Um, so let's just jump right into it. Who were the people of ancient Israel? Well, our main idea is the Israelites practiced a religion called Judaism. Judaism is a monotheistic religion which was unique at that time. Abraham and his family, also known as Abram, who was considered the ancestor of the Israelites, migrated to Canaan. Later, the Israelites migrated to Egypt, where they became enslaved by the Pharaoh. Moses led them back to freedom in Canaan, and the Ten Commandments influenced the moral principles of the Israelites. We're going to be looking at those main ideas and several others in this particular PowerPoint. So, ancient Israel is the birthplace of three great monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And they're going to all have, both Christianity and Islam are going to have their roots in Judaism. We'll talk about that in more detail later. But this is the home of all three, or the hearth, the cultural hearth of all three major monotheistic religions of the world today. Ancient Israel dates back to about 4,000 years. If you are a Christian, you refer to those as the books of the Old Testament. If you are a Jew, you would refer to it as the Torah. By the way, monotheism is the belief that there is only one God, and the Jewish people refer to God as Yahweh. In Judaism, you have great people of faith, and those are known as patriarchs, and examples of patriarchs are Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and Joshua. These are men who advanced the cause of the Jewish people and of Yahweh. And these people who came from ancient Israel go today by several names: Hebrews, Israelites, Jews, Semites. But they've all gone through persecution throughout history, from the Babylonian captivity to the Exodus to the diaspora or the diaspora. You'll hear both pronunciations: the Spanish Inquisition, and in most recent history, the Holocaust. We'll go into what all those terms mean as this PowerPoint goes on. So let's look at the names for the Judaic people. The first term for the Jewish people that is often used is the word Hebrew. The Hebrew people, the word Hebrew means from across. And that comes from the story of Abraham, who was originally from the city-state of Ur. Remember that from the Sumerian lesson we had earlier in the year? And he came across the Fertile Crescent, north, across the Tigris and Euphrates valleys until he got to southern Turkey, and then came south down along the Mediterranean coast until he settled in Canaan. So he came from across the Fertile Crescent. Another term is the Israelites. Abraham had a grandson named Israel, which means he has wrestled with God. Israel is the renamed name of Jacob. Originally, his name was Jacob, just like Abraham's original name was Abram. Israel means he wrestled with God, and there's a story where God and Jacob got in a wrestling match, and Israel, or Jacob, limped from that point forward because he wrestled with God. The descendants of Israel are known as the Israelites. And you have the Jews. The Jews are named after Jacob's son, Judah. And so we get the religion name from that, Judaism. We also get an ancient kingdom's name, Judah. When Israel splits in half, the northern half keeps the name Israel. The southern half would take on the name Judah. And it's also a tribe of Israel that is the line of King David. And eventually, if you're a Christian, you believe a line of Jesus. Now, the Jewish people were nomadic tribes that wandered into Palestine around 1900 BC. Mesopotamian society was dominated by the concept of polytheism. If you remember when we talked about the gods of the Sumerians and the Babylonians and the Assyrians, and those gods were moody. So God was there to smite you, and if something bad happened, you must have done something to anger the gods. Well, Yahweh, according to Judaic texts, is the only God, and he has control over everything. And Yahweh, according to Jewish beliefs, called a man named Abram, and he's the first patriarch of Judaism. He calls Abram out of Ur and calls him to go and raise a great nation in what is today Canaan, or the nation of Israel. And in doing so, he made a covenant with Abram and changed his name to Abraham. And this covenant, the Jewish people today believe they are God's chosen people, and Israel to them is their promised land. It was promised to them by God in their point of view. And even today, if you talk to a Jewish person, they will talk about the promised land. The promised land. Abraham eventually settled in that promised land that was known as Canaan. Now, there is a story that goes along with this. Abraham had settled in Canaan, and there was a long time that Abraham and his wife Sarah could not conceive a child. And so Sarah said, "Here's my maidservant, have a child with her." And he had a child with her, and his name was Ishmael. Then later on, at 90 years old, she got pregnant according to Judaic scriptures. And when she was told that she was going to have a child at 90, she laughed. Ha 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 ha. There's no way that I can have a child. Ha 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 ha. That is so funny. And so God silenced her, according to the story, and told her that she was to name her son Isaac. Now, that name has symbolism to it. It means he laughs. Okay? In other words, God had the last laugh. That was what the story was saying. Well, Isaac and Ishmael grew up as half-brothers in a household where a maidservant and a wife were in the same household. And that usually is not a good setting. And eventually, Sarah wanted Ishmael out. Now, this maidservant's name was Hagar, and she told Abraham, "Get rid of them, get them out." And Abraham kicked Hagar out and Ishmael out. And as the story goes, Ishmael was out in the wilderness, and he was comforted by an angel. Now, the Muslim people believe that Ishmael is the beginning of the Arab people, and out of the Arab people would come out of the religion of Islam. So that is Islam's connection to this story. Back to the Judaic people. Isaac, the Jewish people pointed to as their child of promise. And as the story went later on, he was growing up, and God told Abraham to go take Isaac and sacrifice him on a mountain. Okay, so Abraham and Isaac, they're marching, and Isaac's going, Father, where are we going? Oh, you'll see. Basically, it's the way the story went. And eventually, he told Isaac to lay down on this sacrificial thing. And just before he was to sacrifice his son, an angel came and said, don't stop. God was just testing you. And it's from this child that your people will come from. Okay? Well, that's the Jewish people's claim to Abraham. What about the Christian people's claim to Abraham? The Christian people's claim to Abraham goes a step farther. In the same story, God promised that he would have more children than the sands on the seashore. Okay? And that they would be his child by faith. And Christians believe that if you have faith in what Christians believe as being the Messiah, Jesus, you become a child of God and a child of Abraham. So all three of these religions point, with Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, point back to this story with Abraham. And it's a very important piece of all three religions. And here you can see the trek of Abraham from Babylon to Canaan. He actually went farther, went to Egypt, and then came back. There's a story there as well. The story with Abraham was he went to Egypt, and I'm paraphrasing the story. His wife Sarai, or Sarah, was very beautiful, and she was like a stepsister also of Abraham, which today that sounds creepy and weird, but in that time frame it was not unusual. And so Abraham said, hey, just say that I'm your brother rather than your husband, because if I'm your husband, Pharaoh's going to kill me because he likes you. And so Sarah agreed, and long story short, Pharaoh took them in and gave favor to Abraham, and there was a curse that was put on Egypt, and there was this illness, and everybody eventually they found out that no, they weren't just stepsister, stepbrother, they were also husband and wife. And Pharaoh was like, why did you do this to me? Now you brought a curse on my house, and all that get lost. And then Abraham went back to Canaan. Some of the stories you hear are pretty incredible. Now, when Abraham arrived in Canaan, it wasn't like there weren't anybody there. There were people living there. But those people were known as the Canaanites. And there was also a group of people known as the Philistines. And often there was conflict between the groups of the Israelites, the Canaanites, and the Philistines. We're not going to get into all that, but the story about David and Goliath, that's part of that. The Phoenicians were the shipbuilders of the Canaanite world. And what they offered the world was their alphabet. And their alphabet would be adopted by the Hebrew people. They would take their writing from them and adopt it and tweak it and make it their own. And also, the Greeks would take the Canaanite alphabet and create the Greek alphabet. Well, the Romans would then tweak the Greek alphabet, and that's the alphabet we use today. So the Canaanite people are the ones who gave us our alphabet. The Israelites conquered Canaan and established it as their new homeland, their promised land. And the ancient tabernacle was an elaborate structure where the Israelites worshiped God. Now, this is a look at these alphabet letters. Now, this goes back to what I was talking about. The modern characters that you see, A, B, C, G, D, E, F, Z, the Phoenicians had a letter for TH and a separate letter for T, which is pretty cool. And they had a letter for I as well. Well, if you look at the Hebrew, you will see that the Hebrew letters and the Phoenician letters are very similar. Not exactly the same, but by golly, they are very close to being the same. And then if you look to the other direction, Phoenician and Greek, you can see a connection there as well. Now, by the time you get to early Roman letters, it's hard to tell the Roman letters as connected to the Phoenician unless you go right to left here. Look at the Roman letters on the right. Now look at how close they are to the Greek letters. Look how close they are to the Hebrew letters. And now look how close the Hebrew letters are to the Phoenician letters. That's how we got our alphabet, folks. That's literally how we got it. The Phoenician people had small yet sturdy ships, and they were the spreaders of culture in the Mediterranean world. And by 4000 BC, they're sailing single log and simple sailboats on the Mediterranean Sea. By 1200 BC, they're building ships that can carry heavy goods across the Mediterranean Sea. By 1200 BC, they reached the Straits of Gibraltar, which is a narrow place that separates Europe and Africa, and they began sailing in the Atlantic Ocean. By 700 BC, they place boat rowers on two sides on different levels so that they can go quickly through the sea. And we have evidence that by the year 600 BC, the descendants of the Phoenicians, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, are now sailing around Africa to get to India. And this would not be replicated again until the 1400s AD. In other words, about 2,000 years later, by Portuguese sailors. But Phoenician sailors were doing it 600 years before the birth of Christ. It's really incredible. One of the things that allowed them to do it was they began to build ships with two masts on them. In other words, two sails to propel them forward. Later in history, the Carthaginians would, since they sailed people out, they began to establish cities all over the Mediterranean basin. And the most dominant city actually became a city that was not in Canaan. That city was Carthage. Now you're going to learn a lot more about Carthage later, but they would dominate the Mediterranean Sea until the Romans and the Carthaginians got in a war known as the Carthaginian Wars or the Punic Wars. And we'll talk about that when we study the Roman Empire. But the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians are on the same line. Just like here in the United States as Americans, we are not English, but we were once English colonies. And now, honestly, the United States is the more dominant country of the two. But that was not always the case. And so when we go back farther in time, the Carthaginians were colonists of the Canaanites. Now, Jacob had 12 sons. Jacob was a grandson of Abraham. These sons were Manasseh, Naphtali, Issachar, Ephraim, Benjamin, Simeon, Asher, Zebulun, Gad, Dan, Reuben, and Judah. These tribes would then split up Israel, and each of them would have basically an animal or a picture that represented them. For example, Zebulun would be mentioned with the sails of the rudders of the sea, and Issachar would be a donkey, and Reuben would be the desert flower, and Asher would be the Asher tree, and Judah was the lion. So these pictures in Judaic texts all represent a particular tribe of Israel. And the Jewish people today often will still refer to themselves as one of the tribes. Okay? Eventually, the Jewish people would have to move out of Canaan and move to Egypt. And there's a story about that there's the story of Joseph, and Joseph was the 11th child of Jacob, and he was the most favored, and the other brothers got jealous. So, in a long story short, he got this really cool coat that had a whole bunch of colors on it. Colored coats were very rare, very expensive. It would be like getting like the top of the line Nike sneakers today or something like that, and having everything. And your brothers are still wearing like stuff from like Salvation Army. Okay, so you would have, had this one brother who seemed to be getting everything, was spoiled, and the other brothers were like, well, what about us, Father? And long story short, the brothers conspired against Joseph, and they ended up selling him into slavery into Egypt. There in Egypt, he would be a slave, and there's a whole bunch of stories that I'm not going to get into, but eventually he would end up in prison, even though he did nothing wrong. But then he would end up getting out of prison by interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh made him vizier of Egypt. Now, the vizier was the second in command in Egypt, only below the Pharaoh himself. Then a drought hits Canaan, and everybody's coming to Egypt, and they're trying to get food from Egypt because Egypt was the only place that stored up food. And lo and behold, Joseph, who is now vizier of Egypt, recognizes his brothers asking for food, and he asks about his dad, and he does this thing where he tricks them and accuses them of stealing something, but that's just so his father would come to Egypt so he could take care of his father. So he does this trickster thing, and then once everybody's in Egypt and he knows they're in Egypt, he goes, okay, now here's the truth. I'm really your brother, and I want to take care of you, and that's why I did this, and I had to do this so that you guys would come here. And they were in Egypt, and they survived the drought that killed a lot of people there in Canaan. But as time went on, they forgot about Joseph, and eventually the Jewish people would be slaves in Egypt. And this is the story that leads to the patriarch of Moses. Moses was under 2 years old, and the Pharaoh felt like there were too many Israelite babies, so he ordered all babies under the age of 2 to be slaughtered or killed. Okay. After this, he then puts the baby into Moses' mother puts the baby into the Nile River, and lo and behold, this baby shows up at the doorstep of the sister of Pharaoh himself. And she adopts Moses as her own child because she was having trouble having a child. She wanted this child, and he was raised in the royal court as a child of Pharaoh, as a late teenager, early manhood time period. Moses discovers that he wasn't really a royal kid. He was a Jewish person. And then he gets angry and sees an Egyptian slave master whip a Jewish servant. He gets mad. He kills the Egyptian slave master, Moses does, and runs off into the desert, into the land of Gad, where he finds his wife Deborah and her father Jethro, and there he's living the life of a shepherd. All of a sudden he goes from basically living to the top of luxury and civilization to a nomadic lifestyle, not in a civilization, and he kind of finds peace there. But then what happens? He runs into the burning bush. We're going to talk about locusts here in a second. And the burning bush tells Moses, hey, you need to tell Pharaoh to let my people go. And Moses then goes to Pharaoh and 10 times goes to Pharaoh, you need to let my people go. Each time Pharaoh said that no, and a new plague would come upon Egypt. One of the plagues was, and this is where I'm going backwards, was locust. And a locust seems pretty harmless, but when you see a whole bunch of them, they can wipe out all your food crops. And that was a major deal. Eventually, the deal breaker was that Pharaoh said that the firstborn of all the Israelite people were to be killed. God had told Moses that whatever he commanded the Pharaoh was what was going to be done to him. And so that night, the Israelite people, they painted blood of the lambs over top of their doorstep, and the angel of death went over the blood-covered homes, but the firstborn in all the other homes of Egypt died. At that point, Pharaoh said, "You are free to go," but he changes his mind just as the Hebrew people are on the coast of the Red Sea. Now they're surrounded by the Red Sea on one side and the army of Pharaoh on another. And as the story goes, the Red Sea parted. The people of Israel crossed. A pillar of fire separated them from the Pharaoh's army. Eventually, the pillar of fire went away, and the people ended up on the other side on the Sinai Peninsula. When everybody had crossed, as the story goes, the Red Sea, the wind shifted, and the sea collapsed on Pharaoh's army, leaving him desolate. So, the people of Israel are free, right? Well, they kind of are, but they have to learn as the story goes. And Moses goes up to Mount Sinai at the southern tip of the Sinai Peninsula, and there he gets the 10 Commandments. And the 10 Commandments are given to him, and then the Jewish people wander for another 40 years. The 10 Commandments are, no other gods but me. Don't make any idols. Don't take God's name in vain. Keep the day of rest and keep it holy. Honor your mom and dad. Don't kill people. Don't cheat on your wife or husband. Don't steal. Don't lie or bear false witness. And don't covet things that aren't yours. Okay? In other words, be appreciative of what you have rather than worrying about what everybody else has. Those were basically the 10 Commandments. Now, I summed them up. That's the quick version of it. And then, for 40 years, the Jewish people wandered. As the story goes, Moses himself was not allowed to go into the promised land. And just before the people were to cross the Jordan River to go into the land of Canaan, Moses went upon a high mountain, and there he passed away. Meanwhile, the people that were left were now led by a man named Joshua. Some of you may know the song, Joshua Fought the Battle of Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down. Now, I'm not the greatest singer in the world, but it gets the point across. That song is a African-American spiritual, and it is about the story about the Israelite people who were once slaves are now going off to be conquerors, and they're conquering not in the way that conquerors normally conquer. As the story goes, they had to go around the city walls of Jericho and play their instruments. And on the seventh day, the walls, they fell down, and then the armies of Israel were able to go in and attack the city of Jericho. By 1230 BC, Joshua had invaded Canaan and the Promised Land. And for about 200 years, Israel is ruled not by kings, but by these group of people known as judges. These were just people that everybody respected and they would take their problems to. But by 1020 BC, Israel was going to have a king called Saul. Saul will be the first king of Israel, and by the story accounts, he looked like a king, he walked like a king, he He talked like a king, but he wasn't very kingly. Meanwhile, he would be replaced by King David. It would be known as the greatest king in Israelite history, and then eventually King David would be replaced by his son King Solomon, who was known to be the wisest person in the world in his day. Solomon had the Temple of Israel built. The Temple of Israel would be destroyed twice. First in the 500s BC, and then again in the year 70. In the 500s, it was destroyed by the Babylonians. And in the year 70, it was destroyed by the Romans. The only remaining part of the temple, if you look at the picture down on the bottom right, that wall on the bottom right is part of the old temple, and that's called the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. And if you can look and pay real close attention, you can see people kneeling and praying down there. And people actually write prayers and on a piece of paper and stick it between the stones of the old temple. Now the Jewish people now have control of this area again. They became a country in 1948, the country of Israel. And a lot of the Jewish people, they want the temple to be rebuilt on this site, but there's a little major, huge problem. Do you guys see that golden dome in the picture? Yeah, that golden dome, that's called the Dome of the Rock. It happens to be the second most important holy site in Islam. Oops. There, the Muslim people believe that Muhammad went up into heaven and saw what heaven was like and came back to earth and wrote it in the Islamic holy text, which is called the Quran. And so today, you really have, you can go to this area right here, this block, and within this block, Christians also believe that Jesus was in this temple during his day as well. If you read in the Christian New Testament, Jesus was in the temple when that temple was still around. So you'll have Christians, you'll have Jews, you'll have Muslims all praying, all right there. And they're all right there in that physical space. I mean, it really is incredible to see. I would love to see it in person someday, but I've seen a lot of videos from people that have been there, and it is just the videos themselves were incredible. All right, so to review, in the book of Samuel, Saul, the first king of Israel, failed to reach a decisive victory against an enemy tribe, the Philistines. God sent the prophet Samuel to Bethlehem and guided him to David, a humble shepherd and a talented musician. Saul was so taken with the young man that he appointed David as his armor bearer, but later on, he would try to kill him. And then David ran away, and David was in hiding. And by the way, King Saul's son, Jonathan, was like King David's best. Yo, homie, my dad's so crazy. And, long story short, David would eventually become the next king of Israel. Oops. The Hebrew Bible tells the story of David, a shepherd boy who killed the giant Philistine warrior Goliath with stone from a sling. Later, David became a famous warrior and Israel's greatest king. And according to the Hebrew Bible, David was anointed king by the prophet Samuel. In anointing David, Samuel poured oil on David's head as a sign that God chose David to be the king of Israel. According to the Hebrew Bible, the Torah, David had to be called in from the fields where he was tending his sheep when Samuel arrived to anoint him. To anoint is to pour oil over one's head in a ritual. Now, King David's son was Solomon. He became extremely wealthy. It is said that he owned over 12,000 horses with horsemen and 1,400 chariots. He wrote 3,000 proverbs and 1,005 songs. Solomon was best known for his wisdom. One famous story, known as the Judgment of Solomon, tells that of a settling of a disagreement over who was the true mother of a child. To solve the problem, he ordered that the child be cut in half. Now, only one of the two women claiming to be the child's mother protested, saying she'd rather see the child go to the other woman than see the child killed. Now, that's the real mother. According to the story, Solomon knew that this was the woman that was the true parent, and he awarded the child to her, the one that said, just, I'll give him up before you kill him. The temple was built by Solomon and is believed to have been 180 feet long and took 7 years to build. Now, after Solomon's death, the kingdom of Israel split in two. The northern half became Israel, and the southern half became Judah. Israel was conquered by the Assyrians in the year 722. Remember them? They used chariots and they used iron, and the people of northern Israel basically fled the area, and a lot of them ended up down in Africa and India and all over the world. And sometimes the descendants of those people are often referred to as, quote unquote, the lost tribes of Israel. Judah, the southern kingdom, stayed around for another 150 years or so, and they were conquered by the Babylonians. And this time period became known as the exile or the Babylonian captivity. The emergence of synagogues and rabbis happened during the exile because there was no temple. But in the year 538 BC, the Persians under Cyrus the Great, remember he's the one called the Anointed of the Lord by the Judaic text, we talked about that in an earlier lesson, allows the Jewish people to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. And that's, by the way, Christians believe that's the temple that Jesus walked around in 538 years later. The Persians took control of Babylon, and many exiles of the Jewish people returned to Judah. Under Persian rule, the Jews were not allowed to have their own government leaders, so they looked to their priests and scribes for guidance. And the Torah, the prophets, and the writings make up the Hebrew Bible. I'm going to say that again. The Torah, the prophets, and the writings made up the Hebrew Bible. Well, when the Jewish people were forced to move across the world, that is known as, and I'm going to say two pronunciations here, diaspora or diaspora. It's pronounced both ways. You'll hear both pronunciations. Some people prefer diaspora and some people prefer diaspora. I just want you to know both are the same thing. Okay? In 332, Alexander the Great conquered Persia, Egypt, and India, and Israel became independent again. And in the year 164, these Greek descendants of Alexander the Great's army tried to conquer Israel. And they fought against a group of people known as the Maccabees. And as the story goes, the Maccabees won because of some miracles, and this is the celebration of Hanukkah. Hanukkah. By the way, Hanukkah starts on December 11th, and it's an 8-day celebration, often referred to as the Festival of Lights as well. And you will see the menorah lit, and for 8 days, remembering the 8 days of the miracle of God against the Greek-ruled people who tried to conquer them. However, a century later, in the year 64 BC, the Romans did conquer Israel, or Judah, and it became a province of the Roman Empire. And they renamed it Judea. The people living there were called Judeans, and it's from the word Judeans that we get the word Jew. Okay? And it was between 64 BC and 66 AD. It was in that time period that Jesus was born. And Christians, if you read the Christian New Testament and the life of Jesus, that's the time period they're talking about. In the year 66 AD, the people of Judea revolted against Rome. And this uprising was crushed, and the temple was destroyed for a second time in the year 70 AD, and it has not been rebuilt since. Despite the the dispersion of the Jewish people through the diaspora throughout Europe after 70 AD. Their culture and religious beliefs have been by far the most influential of all the ancient cultures of the Near East. Now, we mentioned this Judas Maccabeus, or Judah Maccabee. And it's not cooperating with me. There we go. Judas Maccabeus, or Judah Maccabee, led a war striving for religious and intellectual freedom. Today, the Jews celebrate the holiday of Hanukkah in honor of the return of the Jewish worship in the temple in Jerusalem. Judas Maccabeus led the Jews to victory over the Greeks, who had taken over the temple and placed their own idols inside. The temple was rededicated and cleansed after it was retaken. Judas Maccabeus is considered a great Jewish warrior. Well, the impact of ancient Israel. First off, the concept that God has a promise with people and has a relationship with people, that comes from the Jewish people. And that concept is in a lot of other religions in the world today. The spiritual ideas of Judaism, like in morality and ethics and conduct and how we interact with one another, a lot of those spiritual ideas have had a profound influence on Western culture and our legal system. And then three of the most dominant religions in the world today, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all derive their roots from the spiritual beliefs of the ancient Israelites. All right, guys. I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and you guys take care, and I will talk to you Monday.